um, how did you know this idea was it, right? Like this is the idea that you should kind of take your chances with, quit your job, right? Kind of apply yourself full time to this, because this wasn't the very first idea you've ever had for a company, is it? Like,
No. Yeah. So I guess like for sort of telling the story, a bit of context is needed, and especially about my co-founder. So my co-founder, Kair Kasper, he's basically has been one of my best friends since the year 2000. We went to high school together, or I don't even know what the equivalent of is, or the
like
correct name
middle
for
school,
seventh grade.
junior high school? Yeah. So,
Yeah.
it's year 2000, you were in seventh grade.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
And like from that point onwards, we've been sort of doing all kinds of stuff together. Like there was a peak in that where we had projects together. We had like a common group of friends. We shared an apartment, and we worked at the same company. So
That's a lot of togetherness.
yeah, I know. Like we have sort of we don't live together anymore, but we certainly have projects together, and we had like we did like high school debating together. We had like some sort of small businesses together when we were like 20. We've had like all the different formats of trying, and all the sort of levels of seriousness of doing business together. We've been through it, like up until Qualitista, which is now VC backed and people working full time, and sort of I'm working full time here. And like that's definitely like this is the sort of peak when it comes to like being serious about a business.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So what are some of the ideas that you've worked on in the past that that didn't get as far as this idea's gone, right? Because this is the idea that has gone the furthest, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So and like you will be able to tell from like what the ideas were that like I was sort of maybe at a slightly younger age. Like the first thing that we did together was so there's a really large beer festival in Tallinn where I live, where we both live, and we just had like a stand there, and we were selling beer, like the same beer that everybody else was selling. And like we came up with a couple of like fun ideas for sort of loyalty program. So like whoever came to the beer stand and like said like, hey, it's me again, like they got a little discount. So everybody was wondering like why did we have a queue when we were selling the same beer and nobody else did. After that we had like some we were selling some t-shirts, like some sort of cool design t-shirts we found
Yeah.
in the Netherlands. So we imported them here. We sold them in a department store, which now, like thinking back on it, was like, how did that like fairly sort of upscale department store even accept our sort of random sort of
Right.
t-shirts? But didn't really sort of, we didn't like make money, or we didn't make significant money on either of those things. But the one that was more serious was, and it's like, it's online to this day. It was our sort of first software thing, and namely an applicant tracking system. So that was in 2014 when I had some experience working for some startups. Kair was working at a SaaS company, and like it also started with like a personal pain that like back in the day I hadn't had any sort of contact with like HR software or recruiting software at all, and like that was probably also the sort of first sort of seed for that not going anywhere. The fact that I hadn't really been in that area all that much, but kind of came up with this idea for creating an applicant tracking system that's sort of lightweight, that is easy to use for small businesses, and hey, let's just try that. And that was a side project. So we got we got like a technical co-founder, and we just kind of started doing it on the side.
Okay, and so this was in 2014, right? And so this was like a software, product. How did it go? Like you built it, and then what happened?
Well, you can probably guess by the fact that I'm talking here like as a CEO of another company, and not of that like how it went. But it didn't. Long story short, like we didn't really put the necessary effort in, and because of that, it didn't really go anywhere. Like it's still technically alive today. Like you can use the product. So jobkitten.com. It's an applicant tracking system. It's like has some sort of has a similar cat in the logo as Qualitista, which is another story of like how that happened. But it doesn't really have too many active users. Like nothing really worth writing home about.
Right.
What's interesting though is that we did notice like an uptick in usage this year, and it turns out because we also made it free, so it's like you don't need to, because we're not really sure doing anything with it. We figured like, hey, let's just make it free, and maybe like somebody will pick it up, and somebody did. So there are some users, and it turns out that it's out of all places, it's popular in Nigeria.
Okay.
So in Africa, and like, as you can probably guess, like we didn't do anything in particular to like communicate that product for the African or Nigerian market. Right. But all it took was basically one, like a startup hub that sort of found it as a free tool, posted a bunch of jobs, had a bunch of applicants, and now like there's some traffic. Like it's still not enough to be viable as a business or anything like that, but there are users.
So how did you, or when did you know like this didn't seem like it was gonna take off?
Yeah, I think the sort of, obviously, as most of these business ideas they start like as a side project. Like normally people are most people are employed, and I think that's rather the exception, that people sort of quit their job first and then start thinking about, I wonder what business I should start. That rarely happens. Or maybe, of course, it's possible that you get laid off or something, and then you sort of are in that situation. But usually, like in my experience, it seems that most of these things, they start as a side project. So it also started as a side project, and we built the product, and we got really lucky. We had a technical co-founder who was really experienced, and he's with us in Qualitista now, actually.
Okay.
So that was definitely like a big, like a significant silver lining, like in that sort of, I guess, what you can call a failure. Or who knows, like the story hasn't quite ended yet. Maybe
it's not over, right?
Maybe like every business in Nigeria will start using JobKitten, and will become celebrity.
It'll spread to the rest of Africa.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible.
Right?
It could. Hasn't happened yet though. So like he built, I think, a great product. So he has experience from Skype, and he's like front end and UX or UI building skills are just world class.
Right.
So it's actually not a bad product, but when we sort of got into trouble was the moment where we should have started to sort of market it to sort of make traction happen, basically,
Mm-hmm.
like
Mm-hmm.
whatever it takes.
Right.
And at that point, like me and Kyra, we were both sort of very positively engaged in our day jobs. So we were getting like really interesting challenges. So I
Mm-hmm.
think at the time, like my support team was growing. At some point I was sort of handed extra responsibility for like another department. So we merged inside sales and support. So like I basically got like a second job at
Mm-hmm.
Pipedrive.
Mm-hmm.
So I was being kept pretty busy at Pipedrive.
Right.
And at the same time, like we didn't, because it was like sort of a random idea. I felt that it is something that it was a pain that I had that we were solving with this applicant tracking system. But like that was it. It's like there was no sort of in-depth understanding of that market, of that issue. Like long story short, we didn't know what we were getting into.
Right. Right. So you started with an idea and kind of a pain point, right?
Yeah.
And then you created a product, and then you realized there's a lot about the market that you didn't know,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And
So go ahead.
no, and so that combined with your job also being really busy and interesting, kind of did that make it harder to put time into this applicant tracking system?
Yeah, definitely. So it was like, um, of course, there's a certain sort of phase in the beginning of every company where there are no results, there are even no signals, and if you don't get that, if you don't have a lot of faith and sort of maybe sort of time for sort of dealing with that situation, then that's when many of these projects die, I think. And that's I think in some ways it's what happened to us, that we didn't have like a really deep understanding of the market. We didn't have like a very clear path in our minds, like, okay, like this needs to happen, and then that, and then we're going to sort of sell it to these people. Like that wasn't really there. So
yeah, I feel like that's the common narrative, right? Of find some, like, build a product around some pain point, right? And then there's the question mark, like, well, great, but then what happens next, right? And sometimes you end up with a product that solves a particular problem, right? But nobody knows about it, or there's not a clear path to
but the thing for us was that like we knew all of that in theory, like already back then. We had we sort of read the blogs and sort of listened to the podcasts, and we're sort of into SaaS and all that. But I think we were being a little bit arrogant, I think, thinking that this sort of random little thing that I experienced once at a previous job, like that was enough of like an epiphany to sort of build a product and the business around.
Right.
So for me, I think the sort of key learning from that was that like it's like of course you can get lucky, and maybe if we would have sort of put more resources towards that project, maybe it would have gone somewhere.
Sure.
I'm pretty sure it would have been like something, but at the same time, I think we would have had to like work really hard to get to the sort of core of the problem, not just think like, I think these guys sort of who have been in the business like I can do it better, without any real deep understanding of that market or that area or the problem that I was solving. So
so how did Qualitista start, and like how did it end up being different?
Yeah. So Qualitista started in the same way, in the sense that uh, I thought I was going to sort of solve a problem that I was having.
Hmm.
And in the same way, it was a side project. And like, it's strange. I actually remember the exact moment when I first sort of got the idea, because like, even, like later that evening, I spent 2 hours talking to Kyra about it. And like, I immediately went to him because I've kind of decided for myself that like I like, we're sort of so sort of close that I just want to do whatever I do. I want to do it with him because I know it just works.
So what was that moment? Like what was the kind of the trigger?
I was on a treadmill in a gym. I really, and it was more or less like this. It was pretty dark and rainy outside, and I was just sort of looking through a window into darkness and just like listening to something. And I think it was around the time when um, we were getting into trouble with our processes at Pipedrive when it came to like ticket review. So it, when I first started, like from day one, like already going into it at Pipedrive, it was clear to me that I need to, or we need, as a group of managers, we need to have like a solid grasp on quality, on what we are actually telling our customers, and that there needs to be like a feedback loop. Because if you have, at the time we had like 2,000 conversations with our customers every month.
Hmm.
We were onboarding new agents, and my sort of anxiety as a head of customer support was that like it can't be all good. Like if we have new people sort of joining, and I knew that they weren't always getting like
Hmm.
training as quick as possible because the company was growing, all those
Right.
things. So we first started with like a meeting. So it was just me and two of the sort of senior support agents. So we sat together in a room. We picked like random samples of conversations that
Hmm.
agents had with our customers. We made notes, and that was the whole process.
Right.
And then we added some more people and more agents, more managers. Then we couldn't do it as a meeting anymore. Then we had a spreadsheet,
Yeah.
and it was a mess. It was all over the place. Everybody was using like a different scale. Some were using like freeform comments. Others had like a 5-point scale and
Gotcha.
different sheets. And
Yeah.
that moment when we had that very messy spreadsheet, like that was the moment for me. Like this shouldn't be how it's done. And
Right.
that's when I sort of started thinking about it and researching it. And at the time, there were no tools, so
Right.
like that's how it basically got
So
started.
so after you had that conversation, what happened next?
Yeah. So the first reaction from Kyer was, I mean, uh, like that's like one key thing that we are on the same wavelength most of the time, but also like when
Mhm.
the other side is the other the other guy is having like a sort of an idea that's not super solid, then like the other one will say like, no, like you're an
Mhm.
idiot. That was like obviously like one of the times when he was like, okay, like you I think he trusted, or he liked the idea in large part because he knew like that for a fact, that like this was really something that I was going through like
Mhm. Mhm.
professionally. It wasn't like
Right.
a random thing that like, I wonder, like that. I think
Right.
that's probably a problem for people. I was really sort of struggling with it.
Right.
And the more we thought about it, we realized that like it makes sense that there's no product out there like that, because
Mhm.
the software that most of these support teams are using is fairly new. Even
Mhm.
Zendesk is a
Mhm.
big public company, but they were, I think, got founded like in 2009 or something. So
Right. Right.
for
So
for
like
the tech
10.
sector, of course, it's a long time, but it's still not quite enough to sort of develop every possible feature for every use case.
Right.
So
Right. Right.
I think that was like part of the reason why it felt like the right moment to start something like this.
Okay. And so what happened differently with Qualitista compared to the applicant tracking system? Like, what kind of got you to put more time into it, to kind of to even consider like quitting your job,
Yeah,
right, as head of support at Pipedrive to make
yeah,
this happen?
yeah. Well, first of all, it was actually like quite a long journey
Hmm.
from that first moment when we first had the idea to when I quit my job. But there was let's say that like it could be divided into two categories. It was like internal factors um, that were sort of in my control and Kai's control, and then external factors like things that uh, you know just happened to be a certain way at that time. And the first internal factor was that when we did the research, we quite quickly sort of developed a strong vision and like we became fairly confident that we know like what the path should be. With
Mm.
Job Kitten, it was kind of like I like didn't we didn't it felt all over the place. It felt like, yeah, I guess we should try some of these sort of typical things to market, and but we didn't know who our customer was. I think that was the
Mm.
sort of biggest thing for us, because
Hmm.
with Qualitista, I knew exactly, like I was the customer, like me,
Right.
the head of customer support, I was the customer. Whereas with Job Kitten, it was kind of like, yeah, I guess we were the customer, but at the same time, it was a much more general type of product. So if you have something that is super niche, then selling that and marketing that is hard. But at the same time, it could be argued that it's easier because once you sort of know who that small number of customers is, or potential customers are,
Right.
then you can do things that are sort of specifically targeted at them and sort of ignore all the other ideas. We're not going to sort of do like a big outdoor campaign for Qualitista because we know that we are after heads of customer support.
Right. It can make something simpler.
Yeah. So that was the sort of internal factor number one. Um, Internal factor number two, I guess, was the sort of confidence that we had gained from Pipedrive as well. So Pipedrive obviously is a large, successful SaaS company, and we like by that time we had a much better understanding of like what a SaaS company is, how it works, how it should develop. So that also sort of gave us sort of some more confidence. So that sort of all of that sort of was the sort of internal factor like of confidence, like made up of like knowing like who we need to target and how. And the second part was like just having more experience, basically.
Hmm.
But then there were the external factors. The external factor, like the first one was like at the time, like there was nothing, like no competition really, and that was certainly like a completely different scenario from applicant tracking systems, because applicant tracking systems it's like CRM. It's like hundreds or thousands of them, and everybody has their own, and there's just it's very, very difficult to sort of stand out in the crowd. So
So,
that
so,
was
so,
the sort
so do you think that would have kind of changed your decision if like if there were like say a dozen similar systems? Would you have like this
I think
reconsidered
it
and like
it would have played into it. I'm not sure like whether it would have sort of stopped us from doing it, but it's, you know, it's always a factor. And like JobKitten and Qualitista were like at opposite ends of that spectrum in that sense.
Yeah.
But then there was, I think, the sort of other sort of key factor was that like we personally, at least, I was at a key moment. I was getting to a point with my day job where, you know, it was still interesting and it was still challenging, but it was kind of more of the same that I had already done. So that was, I think, like in terms of timing, if I would have had, you know, kept sort of getting like more and more and more challenging sort of things to do at my day job, and like I certainly did. Like, so I had to go to Portugal for 6 months to set up an office there, and that was like super interesting. But when I came back from that, it was kind of like you know, it plateaued a little bit. So I think that was definitely also like a key factor.
Okay.
So like timing wise and what was going on in my day job.
Yeah. So when did you essentially go full time into Qualitista?
Yeah. So I left my job at Pipedrive on May 4th, I think.
Of last year?
No, this year.
Of this year. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
So I've been at it for like full time for about 5 months then, I guess.
And what, you know, what went into the decision to leave your job at Pipedrive? Like, you know, what were the, you know, what happened?
Yeah. So the factors were multiple, and I think most of them are ones that viewers can also sort of guess. Like there were factors related to timing. There was like what was going on in my day job at the time, like the sort of how challenging that was or wasn't. Then there was, you know, finances obviously as well. And then the sort of big question was like, okay, but what do I actually want to do if I leave all the sort of like mundane practical aspects aside and sort of try to sort of have some sort of clarity on like what I would actually like to do and sort of work my way backward, like how do I make it happen? And I think that was the sort of that was definitely the sort of deciding factor, because I did realize that like I want to try doing my own business, and then I started sort of working my way backward from that.
How to make it work?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So,
yeah.
So you knew this about yourself, right? Because I mean, it seems like you've had an interest in running your own business for a long time, right? So like, so now that this came along, how did you work out the finances, right? Because I think that tends to be a big wall that some people can kind of see. How do you climb that wall, and other people maybe like don't see how to get past that.
Yeah. So I mean, I was lucky in my circumstance in the sense that we sort of decided that I'm going to leave and do this a long time ahead of my actual sort of departure. So I had
so you had lots of time for planning.
Yeah, so I had several months of like knowing that I will quit at point X, and that worked well for both sides actually, because I committed to sort of helping find my replacement. Hi, Tamara, if you're watching this, and that that was sort of, it was like a win-win
Mhm.
for both sides,
Right.
because I could sort of spend more time figuring out like how I will do the transition.
Hmm. Hmm.
Uh, and Pipedrive at the same time sort of didn't have like somebody just sort of going missing all of a sudden.
Right. Right.
So we agreed on a sort of fairly long timeline for that whole transition, and that gave me sort of like knowing ahead of time. Like I think it was 4 months or something like
Hmm.
that. Like that was like it helped. But when I said I was lucky in my circumstance, it was also because what I've mentioned earlier, that I didn't have like crazy debt or
Hmm.
like lots of like a big family to feed, and
Hmm.
um, that certainly sort of gave me confidence that
Yeah.
I don't really have much to lose financially.
Right. Right.
Um, and obviously, I also sort of got to work on funding, so I was prepared for leaving Pipedrive and sort of just living off my savings for some time.
Okay.
But luckily, it didn't come to that, because that buffer was long enough for us to actually secure VC funding,
Mm.
and I was able to sort of seamlessly transition into my new role. Um,
So did you
Obviously,
secure the VC funding before you left Pipedrive?
yes,
Okay. Okay.
correct.
So right. So then you were able. So then you had some funds to work with as far as once you transitioned.
Yeah, but I don't think it was like all of those things, like those decisions and sort of the sort of
Mhm.
the foresight, like that was within like
Yeah.
4 or 5 months. I wasn't like
Hmm.
years of planning and saving.
Right.
I sort of knew ahead of time a
Right.
few months, and I was sort of calculating that
Hmm.
I would sort of survive on my savings like for a few months, but not like I didn't have money stashed. I didn't really have too many savings at all. Like in
Right.
terms of like I couldn't have and still couldn't sort of live years
Yeah.
and years without working. Like
Yeah.
that's not feasible.
Yeah. So a couple of questions there. One was, did you consider what would happen if you ran out of savings, like what you would do?
Yeah. Yeah, like my sort of internal sort of
Hmm.
motivation speech was always that like it's like I have a good network.
Hmm.
Like I was leaving Pipedrive on good terms. I knew, enough people around me that I could probably approach if I like was actually in that situation, that I could
Hmm.
depending on what my sort of end goal would have been, like if it was just to sort of get by until we have funding,
Hmm.
or actually maybe Qualitista for like whatever reason isn't working at all anymore, then I could have just gone back to like
Gotcha.
having a regular job.
Gotcha.
So I I basically was confident enough in my own sort of network and capabilities that I'll figure it out.
Right.
And again, I didn't have one thing that I did do though was sort of cut my costs.
Mm.
So rather dramatically, even. So I did sell my nice car. Uh, I got rid of like one thing that people don't
Uh-huh.
realize, how many subscriptions you have.
Okay. So you went minimal lifestyle,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
right?
Uh,
Um,
I wasn't like living like a lavish lifestyle to begin with, but I did sort of cut costs.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's usually easier to cut costs than it is, uh, especially at the beginning of things, right? Than it is to like um, bet on like, okay, well, you'll just make more money,
Yeah,
you know? Okay, so you said this had been, months in planning, right? So would you say there was more kind of like the internal factors that were driving you to say like, let's dive into this and figure out like how I can move into this full time? Or was it, or were there things happening, or was it more external factors of things were happening with Kuala Tista, and you were kind of feeling like, okay, there's signals here, right, that are telling you that like it would be a good idea to to go full time into it.
Yeah, so I think it was both, but I think I could have gone longer without going full time. It would have been possible because we only had a few customers at the time when I sort of did the transition or made the leap. But one thing that I think was absolutely key was a conversation with the Pipedrive CEO and founder Timo, and he sort of asked some of the sort of some of these sort of very sort of basic questions, like, okay, but like what is it that you actually want to do? And what I mentioned before, that I was kind of like trying to understand myself, like that he definitely drove me to sort of think about it. And like him asking some of those questions, I think that was sort of the key trigger there, because
do you remember a question or two that kind of was impactful to you?
Those questions were like very simple. Those questions were like, okay, but what do you want to be like? What is the situation that you want to be in a year from now, or eventually, when it comes to this whole thing? And then we, like, after getting sort of answers to those questions, it was clear for both of us, okay, then there's no point in sort of postponing these sort of decisions. So the decision was made. It's just that we sort of postponed the actual sort of moment when I sort of left the company. And I think it was also interesting, like, and I never really asked him that, like, whether it was because of that, but I suspect that maybe he just sort of recognized like that situation, because when Pipedrive was founded, he and his co-founder were in a very similar position, actually, because they were the top consultants at a sales training firm, and they were like really doing quite well. And they also sort of went to the founder of that company, who was one of the first investor in Pipedrive, and said like, hey, look, we have this idea for sales software. And that was in 2010, and like it was unheard of that anybody sort of would go into software in Estonia at all.
Right.
But that the founder of that company was like, oh, okay, so you guys are like the top revenue drivers in my company, and you want to go do this other thing? Go ahead, I'm going to invest in you.
That's awesome.
So in a way, I think he was sort of doing me a favor that somebody else had done for him in the past. So maybe that played into it. Don't know for sure.
Very cool. Very cool. And so at that point, I mean, it kind of sounds like it was a lot of the driving factor was kind of like there was an opportunity for you to take this further, right? For this to kind of to run this business. Did you? And I'm guessing there wasn't a lot of customers at that time.
No.
And so, so what was there any like difference between? Because also like with the applicant tracking system, like there was a lot of customers in the beginning too, right? Like, did that feel any different, or were you primarily driven by like, okay, like this is something that you know who the customer is, right? Like you've got a lot more experience, in a SaaS business. So was it more driven internally of like, okay, this is, like you're more prepared, right? And
yes,
therefore you should like do this, or how much of it was kind of like there are signals from like the market or from customers that you should like?
Yeah. So like, well, first of all, like with the applicant tracking system, we didn't really have like in terms of like customers or revenue, we never had had really any, like
Right, because it was free.
yeah, and like all the sort of like users and everything that came already after, like when we weren't really being very serious about it.
Mm-hmm.
But with Qualitista, it was I think we had a better understanding of what is necessary to raise money. Like if we want VC funding, then what is the sort of minimum that is needed? And we sort of consulted some people that we knew about it, and once we had an understanding of what's the sort of minimum sort of that is sort of needed in terms of traction, and we realized that there need to be some paying customers, at least one or two, and that's what we kind of aimed for, and decided that if that happens, then we will sort of start the process and start talking to VCs. So like at that point, we like once we got our first paying customers, then that was the sort of final tick in the sort of checklist of what would make a good story for investors.
Right. It's a lot more compelling if you have customers in that story than without.
Yeah, for sure. Like it's always the story is sort of comprised of certain elements, like, and when it comes to like a startup pitch, then having somebody that sort of has experience, like in general, has experience in that field, in that sort of particular market, like that's very important. If you have an idea, I don't think it really matters. I think people put more emphasis on the idea sort of element than I think it actually deserves. Like there's sort of unsung heroes of that sort of startup story. Like when it comes to like having like the elements of people that really know the market, for example, and a path to success, like an idea for the path to success, not the idea itself, but like how you will take that idea and sort of make it something that's successful. And I think we had all of those other things, but we didn't have the paying customers. So once we got the paying customers, then that was like, okay, now we have it. Now we can go pitch some investors.
Right. Because I agree with you. I feel like ideas are overrated.
Yeah.
And there's this idea that if your idea is like so brilliant that will like trump everything else, right? And people will just come to you, which I don't think really happens that often in the real world.
No, I don't think that happens either. It's
and so and so related to that, I think that's why I'm also not a big fan of looking at seeing what's out there in the market, right? Because whether a market is crowded or not, right? Like I think that also ties into kind of an overemphasis on like the idea thing, because really I think what you've talked about is far more important of like, well, how do you get to customers, right? How do you find customers? How do you kind of convert them from people who have a problem to people who want you to solve their problem, right?
Yeah. And I now recall that because I think Kyer, he reads like startup blogs and that kind of literature, like even more than I do. And at the time, I think he had just sort of come across some sort of like a formula for like or some sort of startup guy or a VC or somebody had sort of like formulated like these sort of 5 criteria for business ideas for testing them, like whether it's a niche market, whether you can sort of achieve exponential growth, and whether you can sort of do this and this, and whether the market. And I think the Qualitista idea actually hits all of those criteria. And like the actual idea, I think like what it is
Hmm.
was only one of like 5 or 6 factors, and I think that's a pretty good sort of description of the reality that it plays into it. But it's those are all like multipliers. So like it shouldn't be zero, because everything, if it's zero, then sort of the outcome of the equation will probably be zero. If it's like
Right.
it should be a decent idea at least.
Right.
But those other factors play into it to a very large extent as well. And I think it's just like mostly it's execution. And it's like it's weird. I've even started to, especially sort of looking at some of the sort of past few years and like what's going on in politics and sort of different countries. And I'm not going into like any of that. I just wanted to say that, like, personally, I'm starting to believe that even when it comes to those kinds of ideas, execution sort of can make, even if you have like a bad idea, then
Yeah.
execution matters more. It just does.
No, yeah, I think execution matters a ton, right? It's the what is it? The 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Um, yeah, and I think that's the thing, right? It's like at the end of the day, it's it comes down to what your product is doing for people, right? Because you can start with a beautiful idea, but if you can't execute on it, it's not going to work for people.
And then the other thing is that if you have a very complicated idea, then you know
Yeah,
that I personally, I don't know, like my mind works in a way that you know, I'm not particularly good at sort of executing on very complex plans.
hmm
There
hmm
needs to be something like very, very sort of simple at the core of it in order
yeah,
for me to sort of not have to think about that sort of idea or plan all the time.
yeah,
Um, so if if uh, if like whatever your business
yeah,
idea is, if it lacks the sort of uh, very simple basic idea
mhm,
on top of which you can always sort of elaborate and build, but like at the core, I think it should be sort of simple enough for you to intuitively understand and not have to sort of constantly sort of process it, because
hmm
that kind of takes away from your power to actually execute it.
right, right. Yeah, yeah. I think for me, it, like when I hear ideas, um, I have like one question I'll ask people, which is, how will you sell it? Right? Because if you don't have an answer to that, then then I would say you're not in business yet, right? Because um, if you know how to sell it, then you know how to make money from it, which then a puts you in business, right? But then it makes everything else almost like an execution slash logistics problem, right? Like, okay, well, you can sell it for to make this much amount of money, right? Like, then can you deliver? So that becomes like your budget to work
Yeah,
with, right? As long as you're able to, to make this happen, spending less money than you make, right? Then you're in business.
yeah,
Yeah.
totally.
Cool. So, all right. So I know we talked quite a bit about kind of like how this, how you got to quitting your job and kind of doing this full time. I think, one thing I want to explore in a future episode is the VC part of it, because that's, that is something that we hear a lot about, right? And I would guess most of us don't have a lot of personal experience with VCs
Yeah,
or pitching to them, right? But but it's an interesting thing to learn about, right? And certainly could make the or it could certainly help with the question of like, well, how do you finance, this especially in the beginning.
yeah, and that was as I mentioned, that was you know a big part of the period when I knew that I was going to sort of quit, and before I did, like
Right.
talking to VPs was, and sort of thinking about that was a fairly long period. So yeah, definitely stories to share in that regard as well.